Maya Daniels had always been told that she flew like she was born with wings. Her father, a retired Air Force pilot, had instilled in her a deep love for aviation, often reminding her that the sky belonged to those who had the courage to claim it. From the moment she took her first solo flight at 19, Maya knew she was meant to be in the air. She had dedicated her entire career to that passion, graduating at the top of her class at the Air Force Academy, serving 8 years as a military transport pilot, and logging over 15,000 flight hours across 6 continents. Now, at 37, she was stepping into a role she had worked tirelessly to achieve. Senior captain at Meridian Airlines, one of the oldest and most prestigious carriers in the country. But on that crisp December morning at Meridian Airlines headquarters, the excitement of a new beginning was about to be overshadowed by an encounter that would change everything. The early morning fog lingered over O'Hare International Airport as Maya walked through the sprawling terminal, her pilot's case rolling smoothly behind her. She had arrived earlier than necessary, wanting to soak in the moment. She checked her watch. 5:17 a.m. 13 minutes until the pre-flight briefing for Flight MA-27 to San Francisco. That gave her just enough time to grab coffee from the crew lounge before meeting her co-pilot. The air in the lounge was thick with the familiar scent of fresh coffee, mixed with the low murmur of early morning conversations. Pilots and flight attendants clustered around tables, reviewing flight plans, scrolling through their phones, or exchanging travel stories. Maya had spent enough time in these lounges to recognize the subtle social dynamics at play. There was always a quiet hierarchy. Senior captains at their usual corners, first officers huddled in their groups, and flight attendants moving in and out. As she stepped toward the coffee machine, she felt it. A shift in the room. Conversations didn't exactly stop, but they hesitated for a fraction of a second. Eyes flickered toward her, some curious, others indifferent, but a few carrying something else: surprise, skepticism, even subtle resistance. She was used to it. According to the latest industry statistics, less than 1% of commercial airline pilots were black women. She had spent her entire career being an anomaly, fielding questions like, "Are you sure you're the captain?" or "Did you always want to be a flight attendant before flying?" She ignored the glances and poured her coffee, stirring in a splash of cream. As she did, her reflection flickered in the metallic surface of the machine. The familiar 4 gold stripes on her sleeves gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a hard-earned symbol of authority. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "You'll have to be twice as good to get half as far." She had lived by that mantra, proving herself at every step. Today, though, she didn't want to prove anything. She just wanted to fly. As she turned to leave, a voice called out, "You must be Captain Daniels." Maya pivoted to find Captain Richard Whitmore, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair, and the same 4 gold stripes on his uniform. His handshake was firm but brief, his smile practiced but not entirely warm. "Welcome to Meridian," he said. "Thank you, sir," Maya replied, maintaining professional poise. "It's an honor to join the team." "Richard," he corrected, though the informality felt more like a test than an invitation. "I'll be your check captain for the next few weeks," he continued. "I assume you've reviewed the flight path for today?" "Yes, sir," Maya said, standing straighter. "I've memorized Meridian's SFO approach procedures and studied the weather patterns. We're expecting some turbulence over the Rockies, but nothing unusual for this time of year." Richard nodded, his face unreadable. "Good. The crew is waiting in briefing room C. I'll meet you there in 5. As he walked away, Maya felt a knot forming in her stomach. She had spent years reading people quickly. It was a survival skill in an industry where clear communication could mean the difference between life and death. Something about Richard's demeanor set off warning bells. She had encountered men like him before, men who smiled while silently calculating all the ways she might fail. She exhaled, took a sip of coffee, and squared her shoulders. First day or not, she belonged here. The briefing room buzzed with activity when Maya entered. 6 flight attendants and First Officer James Chen, her assigned co-pilot, were already seated around the table. James, a young Asian-American pilot with just under 5 years of commercial experience, stood when he saw her. "Captain Daniels," he said with a genuine smile. "I've heard great things. Looking forward to flying with you." Maya returned the smile, about to respond, when the door opened again. Two men walked in, Thomas Barrett, Meridian's Executive Operations Director, and Richard Whitmore. Barrett, a tall man with a permanent scowl etched into his face, cleared his throat. The room quieted. "There's been a change of plans," Barrett announced, deliberately avoiding Maya's gaze. "Captain Whitmore will be taking command of Flight 207 today." Maya blinked, her brain struggling to process what she had just heard. Barrett continued, his voice calm but final. "Captain Daniels, we need you to wait outside while we reassign you." A heavy silence settled over the room. Maya felt all eyes on her. Heat crept up her neck, but she kept her voice steady. "May I ask why?" she said carefully. "I was scheduled for this flight weeks ago." Barrett glanced at Whitmore before responding. "It's a matter of experience. San Francisco is a challenging approach, and given your unfamiliarity with our protocols." "With all due respect," Maya interrupted, controlling her tone, "I've flown into SFO 73 times over the past decade, including in severe weather conditions. My qualifications were thoroughly reviewed during the hiring process." Barrett's expression hardened. "Captain Daniels, this isn't up for discussion. Please, wait outside." For a moment, Maya considered pushing back, demanding an explanation, forcing accountability. But something stopped her. This wasn't the hill to die on. Not yet. So, with all the dignity she could muster, Maya nodded, set down her flight documents, and walked out. The hallway felt colder than it had moments before. She leaned against the wall, her mind racing. In 20 years of flying, she had faced discrimination in countless forms. Passengers requesting a different pilot, colleagues making snide comments about affirmative action. But this felt different, more calculated, more deliberate. She checked her watch. 10 minutes had passed. Then the door opened. It wasn't Barrett or Whitmore. It was James. He looked uncomfortable, apologetic. "Captain," he said in a low voice, "for what it's worth, I think it's bullshit." Maya exhaled, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "Yeah," she murmured. "So do I." Little did they know, those 7 words, "Captain Daniels, we need you to wait outside," had just ignited a chain reaction that would bring down one of America's oldest airlines. Not from the sky, but from the weight of its own corruption. From the moment Maya Daniels first set foot in a cockpit, she knew she was home. Unlike most children, who dreamt of becoming doctors, artists, or athletes, Maya's dreams always involved the vast open sky. While other kids played with dolls or action figures, she built model airplanes with her father, a retired Air Force pilot who never let her forget that she was destined for something greater. "You were born with wings," he would tell her. "You just have to learn how to use them." She did exactly that. By the time Maya graduated high school, she had already earned her private pilot's license, something that put her years ahead of her peers. But simply flying small aircraft wasn't enough. She wanted to fly at the highest level. She applied to the Air Force Academy, determined to prove herself in one of the toughest training programs in the country. It wasn't easy. From day one, she was met with doubt, resistance, and prejudice. Not just because she was a woman, but because she was one of the only black cadets in her class. The expectations were different for her. If she made a mistake, it wasn't just an individual failure. It was seen as proof that she didn't belong. Her father had prepared her for this. "You'll have to be twice as good to get half as far," he had warned. So she outworked everyone. She studied harder, trained longer, and flew with a level of precision that even her instructors couldn't ignore. By the time she graduated, she wasn't just good. She was the best. For the next 8 years, Maya served as a military transport pilot, flying high-risk missions across war zones. She completed 3 tours in Afghanistan, navigating through hostile airspace, landing in dangerous terrains, and transporting soldiers and critical supplies where they were needed most. It was during these years that she truly honed her instincts, not just in flying, but in understanding people. She learned how to read a room, how to sense when someone was under pressure, and how to stay calm in the face of chaos. These were the skills that would later define her civilian career. After leaving the military, Maya transitioned into commercial aviation, a path many veterans took. But she wasn't content with just flying. She wanted to lead. By the time she was 37, she had logged over 15,000 flight hours, flown into nearly every major airport in the world, and had a flawless safety record. When Meridian Airlines offered her a position as senior captain, it wasn't just a job, it was a milestone. She was about to break into one of the most exclusive circles in aviation. Maya knew the statistics. Women made up less than 6% of commercial airline pilots. Black women? Less than 1%. She had spent her entire career being the only one in the room, the only black woman in flight briefings, the only female voice on cockpit radios, the only person who had to justify her presence every single day. It wasn't just about her skill, she had to constantly prove she belonged. Passengers would sometimes hesitate when they saw her in uniform. She had seen their skeptical glances, heard the hushed whispers. Once, a businessman in first class had asked to switch flights when he saw her enter the cockpit. Even some of her colleagues weren't subtle about it. "You're impressive," one had told her once, for someone who didn't grow up around aviation. The assumption was always the same. She was an outsider. But Maya never let it shake her. She had spent decades breaking through barriers that weren't meant to be broken. This was no different. Her first day at Meridian Airlines was supposed to be a celebration, a moment where years of dedication finally paid off. Instead, it was a wake-up call. The moment she met Captain Richard Whitmore, she felt the shift in the air. Whitmore was an industry veteran, a man who had spent nearly 30 years at Meridian. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned. The first words out of his mouth were polite, but his eyes told a different story. "You must be Captain Daniels," he said, extending his hand. "Welcome to Meridian." Maya shook his hand firmly, matching his cool professionalism. "Thank you," she replied. "Looking forward to flying with you." Whitmore smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'll be your check captain for the next few weeks," he continued. "I assume you've reviewed the flight path for today?" It wasn't really a question. It was a test. "Yes, sir," Maya replied without hesitation. "I've memorized Meridian's SFO approach procedures and reviewed the weather conditions. We're expecting light turbulence over the Rockies, but nothing we can't handle." Whitmore nodded. "Good," he said. "The crew's waiting in briefing room C. I'll meet you there in 5. As he walked away, Maya's instincts screamed a warning. She had spent years reading people, commanding officers, fellow pilots, even enemy threats. And she could tell when someone didn't want her there. Whitmore didn't believe she deserved this position. She could see it in the way he looked at her, not as a colleague, but as a problem to be solved. She brushed off the unease and walked into the briefing room, ready to do her job. That was when Thomas Barrett, the airline's executive operations director, walked in with Whitmore. "There's been a change of plans," Barrett announced. Maya's stomach dropped. "Captain Whitmore will be taking command of Flight 207 today," he continued. Maya's fingers tightened around the flight documents in her hand. She had been assigned to that flight weeks ago. "Captain Daniels," Barrett said, his voice sharp with finality, "we need you to wait outside." A heavy silence suffocated the room. Maya knew what was happening. This wasn't about a flight plan. This wasn't about experience. This was about her. She had fought too hard to let them reduce her to an outsider. But she also knew that fighting now wouldn't change anything. So she nodded, set her flight documents down, and walked out. As the door closed behind her, she leaned against the cold wall, her mind racing. This wasn't just an insult. This was a message. They wanted her to know exactly where she stood. What they didn't know, what Richard Whitmore, Thomas Barrett, and the entire Meridian leadership failed to realize, was that they had just underestimated the wrong pilot, because Maya Daniels didn't wait outside for anyone, and they were about to learn that the hard way. Maya Daniels had spent her entire career proving that she belonged. Yet, on her first day as senior captain at Meridian Airlines, she found herself being sidelined with a weak excuse that didn't sit right. After being welcomed by First Officer James Chen and preparing for Flight MA-27 to San Francisco, Maya expected a routine briefing. Instead, Thomas Barrett, the airline's executive operations director, walked in alongside Captain Richard Whitmore and made a sudden announcement. "There's been a change of plans," Barrett said. "Captain Whitmore will be taking command of Flight 207 today." Maya frowned. She was assigned to that flight. "Captain Daniels, we need you to wait outside while we reassign you," Barrett continued. For a moment, Maya thought she had misheard him. "May I ask why?" she asked, keeping her tone calm. Barrett barely met her gaze. "It's a matter of experience. San Francisco is a difficult approach, and given your unfamiliarity with Meridian's procedures—" "With all due respect," Maya interrupted, "I've flown into SFO 73 times in my career, including during severe weather conditions. My qualifications were thoroughly reviewed in the hiring process." Barrett's expression hardened. "This isn't up for discussion," he said. "Please wait outside." Maya knew there was no point in arguing. The decision had already been made. With controlled dignity, she set down her flight documents and walked out of the room. As Maya stood in the hallway, trying to process what had just happened, James Chen stepped out moments later, his face filled with quiet frustration. "I'm sorry, Captain. That was complete bullshit," he whispered. Maya gave him a knowing look. "What did they say after I left?" James hesitated. "They claimed it was standard procedure for new captains to shadow another flight first." He shook his head. "But I've seen 4 new captains start here in the past 3 years. None of them were pulled from their first flight like this." A weight settled in Maya's chest. This wasn't bad luck. It wasn't about experience. It was deliberate. She had spent years navigating prejudice in the aviation industry, passengers who questioned her authority, colleagues who downplayed her achievements. But this was different. This felt orchestrated. "Where are they sending me instead?" she asked. James sighed. "You're being reassigned to Shadow Flight 422 to Seattle. It's just a short hop flight." Maya's jaw tightened. They were sidelining her on purpose, and this was only the beginning. Maya Daniels had expected resistance at Meridian Airlines, but she hadn't expected to be deliberately sidelined on her very first day. After being pulled from her scheduled flight under the pretense of inexperience, she was reassigned to Shadow Flight 422 to Seattle, a short, routine flight. Her assigned captain for the flight? Harold Wilson. Maya had never met Wilson before, but she knew his reputation. He was one of Meridian's most senior captains, an old-school pilot who had been vocally opposed to efforts to diversify the industry. He had been at Meridian for over 30 years, and according to industry gossip, he did not believe women, or minorities, belonged in the captain's seat. The moment she stepped into the cockpit, she felt his disdain. Wilson barely looked at her as he gave a curt nod. "I don't know what kind of operation you came from, Captain Daniels," he said, adjusting the radio. "But at Meridian we do things by the book. No shortcuts, no improvisations." Maya knew exactly what he meant. The implication was clear. He assumed she wasn't qualified. Maya refused to take the bait. Instead, she replied evenly, "Standardization is the foundation of safety." Wilson grunted, seeming disappointed that she hadn't reacted. Despite his attitude, Wilson was an experienced pilot. Maya could see that in the way he handled pre-flight preparations. However, experience didn't make someone infallible. As they began their descent into Seattle, Maya noticed something off. Wilson was about to enter the wrong frequency for approach control. The correct frequency for Seattle approach was 128.35 MHz, but Wilson had entered 124.75 MHz. A small but serious mistake. For a split second, Maya hesitated. If she corrected him, would he dismiss her? Call her incompetent? But this wasn't about ego. This was about safety. "Captain, I believe Seattle approach is on 128.35 today, not 124.75, she said calmly. A long silence filled the cockpit. Wilson's shoulders stiffened. Without a word, he checked the approach chart. "That's correct," he said stiffly, adjusting the radio. "Thank you, Captain Daniels." The acknowledgement clearly pained him, but it was there nonetheless. For the rest of the flight, he said nothing. Once they landed, Wilson finally turned to her. "You have a good eye," he admitted grudgingly. "Most wouldn't have caught that." Maya nodded. "Attention to detail keeps passengers safe." Wilson's face hardened. "Don't misunderstand," he warned. "One good catch doesn't make you Meridian material. This airline has traditions. Not everyone fits." Maya held his gaze. "With respect, Captain, traditions evolve. They have to." Wilson's pale blue eyes grew cold. "Not at Meridian. They don't." At that moment, Maya understood something deeper. This wasn't just about prejudice. There was something rotten inside Meridian Airlines, something they didn't want outsiders like her to see. And she was going to find out exactly what it was. After weeks of being sidelined and subjected to subtle but deliberate acts of exclusion, Maya Daniels knew there was more to Meridian Airlines than just its outdated culture. During a layover in Chicago, she struck up a conversation with Marcus Jefferson, a senior maintenance technician who had been with the airline for over 2 decades. Unlike many of the employees who avoided discussing internal matters, Marcus was open but cautious. As they spoke near the maintenance hangar, he hinted at serious issues within the airline's operations. According to Marcus, maintenance procedures were being rushed, and inspections that once took hours were now being cleared in half the time. The pressure from upper management to reduce aircraft downtime meant that small issues were being ignored, and critical repairs were sometimes left incomplete. The airline's maintenance logs, which were supposed to be transparent records of aircraft servicing, had inconsistencies and missing reports. Marcus described how newer mechanics were often instructed to sign off on repairs they hadn't fully inspected, and those who refused found themselves transferred, demoted, or fired for unrelated reasons. Maya felt a cold realization settle in. This wasn't just about discrimination or hazing. Passenger safety was at risk. She had seen airlines cut corners before, but this felt systemic, like a corporate decision rather than individual negligence. The more Marcus spoke, the more she knew that this wasn't something she could ignore. She began quietly gathering evidence. She took notes on everything Marcus told her, memorized discrepancies in maintenance logs, and started paying closer attention to how aircraft were being cleared for flight. She also spoke discreetly with other employees, flight attendants, mechanics, and even fellow pilots, all of whom confirmed the same troubling pattern. Maya knew the risks of pushing further. Whistleblowers in aviation often found their careers ruined. But she also knew that if she stayed silent, it was only a matter of time before a catastrophic failure put hundreds of lives in danger. Maya Daniels quickly realized that her defiance had not gone unnoticed. After questioning maintenance discrepancies and standing her ground against senior captains like Harold Wilson, she found herself systematically targeted. Instead of being assigned long-haul flights as a senior captain should, she was relegated to short, undesirable routes, often back-to-back with little rest in between. These were the flights given to rookie pilots, not someone with her level of experience. It didn't stop there. Her authority was quietly stripped away. Flight assignments she was scheduled for were suddenly reassigned, always with vague explanations. When she tried to raise concerns, she was met with dismissive responses from operations management, who insisted it was just part of the transition process for new captains. But Maya knew the truth. They wanted her to quit. Then came the HR complaint. Maya was called into a meeting and informed that she was being placed under administrative review due to concerns about her compatibility with company culture. The accusation was so vague it was impossible to refute, and the HR representative refused to provide specific details. It was clear that this was retaliation, a way to brand her as difficult and justify further sidelining her. Yet despite the pressure, Maya refused to break. She wasn't alone. Quietly, support began to grow among the airline's employees, pilots, flight attendants, and maintenance workers who had faced similar marginalization. First Officer James Chen, who had been skeptical of the airline's practices from the beginning, remained firmly in her corner. Lauren Kim, a senior flight attendant, started confiding in her about safety violations she had personally witnessed. Even some of the ground crew, like Marcus Jefferson, continued passing along information. Maya knew she was up against a deeply entrenched system, one that had operated unchecked for years. But she also knew one thing. She had already come too far to back down now. Maya Daniels had spent weeks enduring retaliation, exclusion, and administrative scrutiny, but she refused to let the pressure silence her. When she was finally assigned to captain a late-night red-eye flight to Las Vegas, she saw it as an opportunity to do her job the right way. However, during her pre-flight inspection, she noticed something off in the maintenance logs. Several routine checks had conflicting dates, and a recent engine component replacement didn't match the aircraft's service history. Trusting her instincts, Maya refused to sign off without further verification. She called for an additional inspection, delaying the flight by 20 minutes. It was an unforgivable offense in an industry that thrived on on-time departures, and she knew the decision would draw attention. By the time the flight landed in Chicago the next morning, she was summoned to Thomas Barrett's office. Barrett wasted no time getting to the point. "Captain Daniels, I understand you delayed Flight 889 last night due to an unnecessary inspection," he said, his tone sharp. Maya remained calm. "The maintenance logs had discrepancies. FAA regulations require all documentation to be complete before flight." Barrett's expression darkened. "Our ground crew cleared that aircraft. You overruled them based on what exactly? A feeling?" "Based on my 20 years of experience and the fact that incorrect documentation can compromise safety," Maya replied. Barrett leaned forward. "At Meridian, we value efficiency alongside safety. Delays cost us thousands of dollars. If you can't trust our procedures, perhaps this isn't the right airline for you." Maya saw the trap, back down, and she would be forced to ignore future safety concerns. Stand her ground, and they would try to push her out completely. She refused to comply. "Mr. Barrett, are you suggesting that I overlook maintenance irregularities?" she asked, her voice steady. Barrett's jaw tightened. "I'm suggesting you use better judgment in the future." Maya nodded, standing up. "Safety is my primary judgment call. Always." As she left the office, she knew she had crossed a line. This wasn't just about a single flight delay. She had just escalated a confrontation that could cost her everything. Maya Daniels knew she was walking a dangerous line, but after her confrontation with Thomas Barrett, she was more determined than ever. If Meridian Airlines was deliberately ignoring safety concerns, she needed proof. Undeniable, irrefutable evidence that could expose the corruption at the highest levels. She began quietly reaching out to those she trusted. Flight attendants, ground crew, and fellow pilots, many of whom had already shown subtle support, became valuable sources of information. Lauren Kim, a senior flight attendant, admitted to documenting safety issues that had been ignored, including malfunctioning cabin pressure valves that were cleared without repairs. James Chen, her former co-pilot, revealed that he had noticed pilots being pressured to skip procedural safety checks to maintain on-time records. The biggest breakthrough came from Marcus Jefferson, the veteran maintenance technician. Under the cover of a late-night meeting in the maintenance hangar, Marcus handed Maya a USB drive. "Everything's on there," he said, his voice low. "Falsified maintenance logs, internal emails pressuring mechanics to approve incomplete repairs, even directives from upper management cutting safety corners to keep planes in the air." Maya took the USB, her heart pounding. This wasn't just negligence. This was criminal. Knowing she couldn't fight this battle alone, she contacted the FAA, setting up a meeting with an investigator specializing in aviation safety violations. But she didn't stop there. She reached out to a journalist from the Chicago Tribune, someone known for exposing corporate misconduct. She knew that once the press got involved, Meridian wouldn't be able to bury the truth. As she gathered the last pieces of evidence, Maya understood what was at stake. If she moved forward, her career at Meridian was over. But if she stayed silent, lives could be at risk. It wasn't a difficult decision. She had come too far to look the other way now. Maya Daniels knew the confrontation was coming. After weeks of gathering evidence, reaching out to the FAA and a Chicago Tribune journalist, and refusing to back down, the upper management at Meridian Airlines had no choice but to make their move. She was summoned to the executive conference room. Inside, she found Thomas Barrett, Richard Whitmore, and two of the airline's legal advisors waiting for her. The tension in the room was suffocating. Barrett didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Captain Daniels, it has come to our attention that you have been accessing restricted areas and soliciting information from employees beyond your clearance level," he began. Additionally, you appear to be collecting internal documents and communicating with outside entities about company matters, in direct violation of your confidentiality agreement. Maya met his gaze, her face unreadable. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Barrett pressed. Maya folded her hands on the table. Am I being fired, Mr. Barrett? The lawyer sitting beside him cleared his throat. We're offering you the opportunity to resign with a generous severance package, provided you sign an NDA covering all aspects of your employment with Meridian. Maya let the words settle in the room. So this was their plan. Buy her silence. She allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Before I respond, you should know that at 9 a.m. this morning, my attorney submitted a comprehensive report to the FAA detailing systemic safety violations at Meridian Airlines, including falsified maintenance records, pressuring employees to overlook safety concerns, and retaliation against those who spoke up. A chilling silence fell over the room. Maya continued, her voice unwavering. Additionally, at noon today, the Chicago Tribune received a copy of the same documentation, along with evidence of workplace discrimination and safety risks. Their investigative team is particularly interested in the case of Paul Decker, the maintenance technician who suffered a career-ending injury after raising concerns about faulty aircraft. Barrett's face turned ashen. You're bluffing, Whitmore snapped. Maya leaned back in her chair. A third copy has been placed in secure storage with instructions to release it to every major news outlet and aviation authority worldwide. If anything happens to me or any employee who cooperated, she paused. So no, Mr. Barrett, I will not be resigning, and I will not be signing your NDA. Whitmore slammed his fist on the table. This is blackmail, Maya tilted her head. No, Captain Whitmore, this is accountability. The lawyers exchanged panicked glances. Barrett, visibly shaken, lowered his voice. What do you want? Maya's expression remained calm. I want every aircraft with maintenance discrepancies grounded immediately. I want a full safety audit by an independent third party. And I want written assurance that no employee who cooperated with my investigation will face retaliation. Barrett hesitated. That would bankrupt the company. Maya raised an eyebrow. As opposed to what happens when the FAA revokes your operating certificate? Or when passengers learn you knowingly flew unsafe aircraft? The room fell silent once more. One of the lawyers whispered urgently to Barrett. After several tense minutes, Barrett exhaled in defeat. We'll need time to... You have 1 hour, Maya interrupted. After that, I call my contacts and tell them to proceed with full public disclosure. Barrett slumped back in his chair, realizing he had lost. The collapse of Meridian Airlines happened faster than anyone could have anticipated. Within hours of Maya Daniels' ultimatum, the FAA launched an immediate investigation, sending inspectors to review maintenance logs, aircraft conditions, and internal safety protocols. What they found was worse than expected. Evidence of falsified maintenance records, pressure on employees to approve unsafe aircraft, and systemic neglect of critical repairs. By the end of the week, the FAA ordered 40% of Meridian's fleet grounded indefinitely, citing serious safety concerns. Flights were canceled, passengers were left stranded, and airports across the country reported delays due to the airline's sudden operational breakdown. Social media exploded, with frustrated travelers demanding answers, and employees leaking insider accounts of Meridian's dangerous practices. Then came the news reports. The Chicago Tribune was the first to break the story, followed by CNN, the New York Times, and major aviation news outlets. Their investigations exposed not only safety violations, but a toxic corporate culture of discrimination, intimidation, and cover-ups. Former employees came forward with their own stories. Pilots pressured to fly questionable aircraft, mechanics threatened for refusing to falsify reports, and flight attendants silenced when they raised concerns. As the scandal deepened, Meridian's stock plummeted overnight, wiping out millions in shareholder value. Investors pulled out, customers canceled bookings, and travel agencies cut ties with the airline. The final blow came when the board of directors, desperate to salvage the company's reputation, announced that Thomas Barrett, Richard Whitmore, and Harold Wilson had been placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. A week later, all three were officially fired, and federal regulators filed criminal investigations into potential fraud and reckless endangerment. By the end of the month, Meridian Airlines filed for bankruptcy protection, marking the end of an airline that had operated for over 5 decades. Maya Daniels had not only exposed corruption, she had brought down one of America's oldest airlines. The Justice Department wasted no time in responding to the scandal that had rocked the aviation industry. Within weeks of Meridian Airlines' collapse, federal prosecutors announced criminal charges against key executives, including Thomas Barrett, Richard Whitmore, and Harold Wilson. The charges ranged from fraud and reckless endangerment to obstruction of justice for their role in covering up safety violations. The FAA, under public and political pressure, vowed to tighten regulations and implement stricter oversight on airline maintenance practices. As Meridian crumbled, Atlantic Airways, a rapidly growing competitor, stepped in to acquire its remaining assets. Unlike Meridian, Atlantic had built a reputation for prioritizing safety and ethical leadership. Their first major move was to offer positions to all qualified former Meridian employees, except those under investigation. For many pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew who had endured years of mistreatment under Meridian's toxic culture, the transition felt like a fresh start. Maya Daniels, however, was at a career crossroads. Her decision to stand against corruption had made headlines, turning her into an industry-wide symbol of integrity and courage. Multiple airlines reached out, offering her a captaincy position. In addition, aviation safety organizations and government agencies sought her expertise to improve airline regulations. Even book publishers expressed interest in her story. For the first time in her life, Maya had the power to choose her own future. She had risked everything, and now, she had options she never imagined possible. With Meridian Airlines gone and its former executives facing justice, Maya Daniels found herself at the center of a larger shift in the aviation industry. What had started as a personal fight for fairness had ignited a national conversation about both safety and diversity in commercial aviation. Airlines across the country began reviewing their internal policies, making changes to ensure greater transparency, stricter safety enforcement, and a more inclusive workplace culture. Maya chose not to return to a traditional airline captaincy. At least, not right away. Instead, she took on a new mission: mentoring the next generation of diverse pilots. She worked with aviation schools and training programs to support aspiring pilots from underrepresented backgrounds, ensuring that the barriers she had faced wouldn't stand in their way. At the same time, the FAA formally invited her to join its Aviation Safety Oversight Committee, an elite panel responsible for enforcing safety regulations, preventing corporate misconduct, and advocating for whistleblower protections in the industry. With her first-hand experience of how airlines could cut corners for profit, Maya was determined to make sure no other pilots or passengers would ever be put at risk the way Meridian had endangered so many. Her fight had started as a battle for survival, but it had become a movement for change. Years had passed since Meridian Airlines collapsed, but the impact of Maya Daniels' actions continued to shape the aviation industry. Airlines had implemented stricter safety regulations, whistleblower protections had strengthened, and pilot recruitment had become more inclusive. Though change had been slow, the industry was undeniably evolving in ways that once seemed impossible. One evening, as Maya sat in her office reviewing reports on aviation safety compliance, an unexpected email arrived. The sender's name made her pause: Richard Whitmore. The man who had once tried to push her out of Meridian, who had dismissed her as unworthy, was now reaching out. She hesitated before opening the message. Captain Daniels, you may be surprised to hear from me, and I wouldn't blame you for ignoring this message. After much reflection during my community service sentence, I've come to recognize the harm caused by my actions and attitudes. While nothing can undo the past, I wanted you to know that your courage forced me to confront truths I had spent a lifetime avoiding. The aviation world is better because you refused to be silenced. For whatever it's worth, after all this time, I am sorry. Maya sat back, absorbing the words. She had spent so many years fighting for change, knowing that people like Whitmore would never admit they were wrong. Yet here it was, a quiet acknowledgement that even those who resisted change could eventually see the truth. She thought about her father, about his words that had guided her since childhood. You'll have to be twice as good to get half as far. He had been right, of course. But she had done more than just survive. She had reshaped an industry. She typed a simple response. Apology accepted, Captain Whitmore. The sky belongs to all of us. As she hit send, she felt a sense of peace. Her fight had been worth it, not just for herself, but for every pilot, passenger, and aviation worker who would now step into a safer, fairer industry. Maya Daniels had once been told to wait outside. Now, she stood at the center of change, and the future of aviation had never looked brighter. Maya Daniels had once been pushed aside, silenced, and underestimated. Now she stood at the forefront of aviation safety and reform, ensuring that the industry she had fought so hard to change would never return to its old ways. As a senior advisor on the FAA's Aviation Safety Oversight Committee, she played a key role in enforcing stricter regulations, improving whistleblower protections, and pushing for more inclusive hiring practices. But Maya never lost sight of what had brought her here in the first place: her love for flying. Despite her influence as a leader and reformer, she still felt most at home in the cockpit. One crisp morning, as she settled into the captain's seat of an Atlantic Airways flight bound for San Francisco, a young first officer, Tasha Williams, sat beside her, nervously adjusting her headset. Tasha was a black woman in her late 20s, someone who had once told Maya that her fight at Meridian had inspired her to become a pilot. "Beautiful day for flying," Maya said with a smile. "Perfect," Tasha agreed. After a pause, she added, "Captain, I just wanted to say, what you did at Meridian, it's why I kept pursuing aviation. When everyone told me to give up, I kept going because of you." Maya looked at her, seeing her younger self reflected in the determined woman beside her. "The sky belongs to all of us, First Officer Williams," she said. "Never forget that." As the aircraft soared above the clouds, Maya knew that she had done more than just fight for her place in the industry. She had ensured that future generations wouldn't have to fight the same battles. She had proven that the sky had no barriers, only horizons waiting to be crossed.